I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This week on the Poetry of Predicament podcast, my guest is Dr. Peter Nelson. I've known Dr. Nelson for quite a few years, and he is a psychologist, social scientist in Australia. And the way that I have come to know Dr. Nelson is he is an extraordinary seer. Some might call those abilities psychic abilities. He would not call them that. I hope you'll join me in enjoying the remarkable skills and abilities of Dr. Peter Nelson. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And this is another in hopefully a series of interviews with Dr. Peter Nelson. I've had the pleasure of contacting and spending time with Dr. Nelson for in a number of different settings, almost all of them having to do with an ally, of a fellow seer that who I studied with here in the States in Southern Oregon for quite a while, a guy named Paul Richards. And Paul would from time to time invite you to participate in one or another of his then many live kind of seminar environments. And it was always such a pleasure to have you bring your particular way of seeing, your particular way of engaging. And then really it always, because this is what you do, you always brought an intersection, I think a really rich intersection of the psychological dynamics that you're aware of given your line of work, and then the energetic or the Seers dynamics that you obviously bring, just given your gifts in that arena. And we were just talking before we hit the record button, Peter, that I still have the thread that I'm going to continue to pull as long as you're willing to have these meetings. You have such a potent combination of skills in both of the areas I just talked about and more. And particularly for someone who has this ability to see the human dynamics, see the beyond human dynamics that are quite possibly available to many people, but I doubt that there are many people who have actually cultivated that gift, actually really know what are these odd impressions that they get from time to time. In fact, I think, as I told you, there are a few folks who have seen the first posted interview from a few weeks ago, and they resonated with it. They had questions because they had seemingly resonant experiences that they would like to talk about, find out more about, and so on. So there's that, is there just a resonance of people getting a sense of maybe this guy's, what he's describing is something similar that I have little glimpses of. And so we have that going on the sidelines. My main interest with you in these talks is, how do you as a seer, how are you experiencing the world? You've been around a while. You've seen a lot of life. You've seen a lot of interesting characters and done a lot of seeing within that time. And my main question for today is, can you tour us through some of the differences that you're seeing now, that you're seeing in these past few years? Because that's, again, what you and I have talked about a few times now, that it's a different world. There are so many very, very different elements at play. And
They're extraordinary. They're hard to. It's hard to find hyperbole for some of them, for my experience. So for a guy like yourself who is seeing in a number of different dimensions that most of us don't. I'm so curious, what are you experiencing? What's your, how might you describe some of the things that have changed in a big way in your time?
Yeah, we always have to parse out aging with, the world looks like it's changing, but, I'm changing because I'm in my 80th year now. So things look really different than when I was in my 40th year. And for a variety of reasons. I mean, everything from biological reasons, your hormones aren't the same anymore, to, now I have a bad knee, and I used to be a major walker. So it was, all these kinds of changes, but parsing all that out, and I spend a lot of time trying to parse that out. The world does look very different. I like to think of, I like these kind of biological metaphors I've been into in recent years, which I think of a herd of sambar deer in East India. These are one of the main prey animals for tigers. As one guide said to a mutual friend of ours, Dick Craig, sambar deer are tiger snacks. And so sambar deer exist in herds, small herds, and they live in forested areas. And like all prey animals, they're constantly on the alert for danger. So, a rustle in the bushes, is it a monkey or a tiger? And now, one of the things that's really changed is that reactive mechanism that we share with all other mammals that is wired into a part of our brain called the limbic system. One of the things is that we all are ready to react to what we might perceive as danger. One of the things that's changed is that the number of danger signals we're receiving is so huge now. Instead of, like the herd used to do, it would hear something, it would react, it might decide to run, the whole herd runs, and then they reassemble down the track, and maybe they're out of the range of the tiger or whatever. But now it's like we as a herd are constantly hearing tigers. The whole issue with social media, and even I notice now online newspapers are doing the same thing. There's a kind of feeding the panic part of ourselves. They're always feeding it. And so the herd's always jumping and running. And as a result, there's a kind of frenetic panic that seems to be going on at a level that I never saw it. 20 years ago, definitely wasn't seeing anything like this. And so that's one thing that's really changed. People seem to be wired most of the time for reactivity. And that reactivity breeds with it a whole bunch of ideation, fantasies about the world and how it's working. And because, we're the kind of animal, we're a storytelling animal. And we just need to explain to ourselves what the hell is going on here. So we're always explaining to ourselves, but there's so much going on, so much stimulus of potential danger that what I'm seeing people do is settle on a particular narrative that then explains everything. Whether you're on the right side of politics or the left side of politics, each side has a kind of a narrative. On the right side of, there's the the elites running the world and running child sex rings, and a series of a limited number of narratives that then are used to explain everything that comes up, and everything, or like the election was rigged. That sort of explains everything. And on the left side of politics, it's like, the capitalists are, destroying our world, and they're going to, make us, their slaves, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd like to not focus on the narratives, but focus on living in the chaos. And your whatever chaos you're around, left, right, or middle, it is more chaotic, and how you live in that. From the point of view of a seer, or someone who is highly emotionally sensitive, what was the term you used to describe
it was
them earlier?
highly sensitive people, HSPs.
HSPs.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, within that group, there are people who are actually picking up what I would call Seers information.
Right.
And there are people who are really just, responding to their oversensitized reactions to everything. And then there are people who are both. There's a spectrum in there where, now, what I want to say to everyone, whatever you are picking up or however you're reacting, one of the ways you learn to manage it is you develop a high threshold for pain. If you get a little bit of pain in a joint and it makes you scream and run, you have to practice focusing on that pain and noticing its qualities apart from the sense you have of wanting to make it go away.
Right.
Because to live in a chaotic world is to like live in constant pain, because it's actually bombarding your nervous system the way pain signals do. Like if you, basically drop, a hammer on your foot while you're using it, you get all these signals coming from your foot up into your brain. And one of the ways you can react is, screaming in pain, jumping up and down, complaining, getting someone, to soothe it or whatever.
Yeah.
But one of the things, if you're always trying to make aversive stimuli go away, or things that, kind of you feel are overwhelming you, then you can't be a seer. Because to be a seer, you're going to see fantastically beautiful things, fantastically ugly things, and a lot in between.
Yeah.
And if any kind of stimulus makes you want to jump and run, then you're going to always miss a whole part of the world. So that's why I say you have to have a high tolerance for pain.
Yeah. If I might just slip in a clarifying question here, what I'm hearing you say, there's some words that I've picked up along the way in, how to articulate the dynamic you're talking about from a different lineage, from a different framing. I've heard what I think you're describing as most of society in this frenetic, constantly wound up, constantly reactive state is actually being externally referent. So even the perception of it and the reaction to it, everything's occurring over there. The causes of it, the triggers of it, my responses of it, and all of that, I believe, is an attempt to keep the actual experience of it, the actual seeing of it outside. This is me making shit up at this point. So this is good. This is very good. So I just wanted to clarify to see if there's a connection between those words to describe it, and the ones you're using. And
Definitely.
and so if I were internally referent, if this actually is something of a fit, I would be oriented to actually experiencing it within me, within myself, rather than that whole externally referent dynamic that I was just describing. And that, I believe, is where you're pointing at upscaling our tolerance, my tolerance to be able to truly perceive what's going on in its grandeur, in its hellacious ugliness, and as you said, everything in between. But it would be internally referent. That perception would be happening in here.
I would put it a little differently. In
Please,
psychology, we talk about internal locus of control and external locus of control. In other words, what drives you? If you go to church to be seen as, a good churchgoer, your external locus of control, because you're defining yourself by your group affiliation and what you're doing. Internal locus of control is I have a set of internal values and beliefs that I reference as a way of doing things. As a result of that, if I'm very strongly one or the other, it's not the position to be in. The position to be in is where you recognize there's a lot of stimulus and pressure coming from the external, wanting to drive what you see and what you understand, and you understand your own reference points that you want to maintain, but you try to find a place in the middle where you're noticing both, but not being directed by either. It's a kind of still place. It's a still place in which you observe the world. When you're a sambar deer and you're reacting to rustling in the bushes, you're all externally focused and you're being driven by that. If you're, let's say, a very introverted person and you tend to block everything out, you set up your life so there's very little stimulus around you, and you want to just reference, your own inner world, it has the same flaw, it has the same, possibility of not seeing. So there's an in-between position, is what I'm talking about, where you're in the middle of everything and you're just observing.
Right.
You're just noticing what's going on around you.
So Peter, if I may, just want to make sure I'm on the same page with you. This still point, this place, I just want to run it by you. Is this similar, this still point that you're talking about, is this a similar location within myself? If I'm a practitioner in a contemplative tradition, some of them call it a one seat, the seat of my attention. This is the area where I would be experiencing the evolution of possible growth of my ability to accurately perceive and to come to terms with the distractions and so on that the monkey mind at the early stages of my contemplative practice. It would be a return to that still point that they would be talking about in the contemplative practice. Is that a similar, or is that the same location that you're talking about?
It could be, depending on how one hears it and how one interprets it. Mm-hmm. Because one of the problems with a lot of contemplative practice is it can also feed a very fundamental narcissism in people, where everything of their attention is pointed constantly to themselves and to their feelings about the world. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about, I usually define three positions. there's the witness, the judge, and the paranoid. And the witness is just the silent observer of what's going on, both internally and externally. So the witness is not actually bringing any kind of judgment. It's not making an assessment of any kind. It's just noticing. And then the judge adds something to the witness, that is evaluations of what's going on. Well, that external stuff is no good. I should stay focused on my own internal values, my own internal beliefs. But that's judgment, which precludes you really taking in the scene, so to speak. Because the scene, if you're judging, one of the things you're doing is you're parsing what you want to know from what you don't want to know, and you're making what you don't want to know try to go away. If you're trying to maintain a position or a belief, then you're in the judge. The paranoid is when the judge starts reacting or overreacting in fear to what he or she is perceiving. So anyway, the witness or the watcher is where you want to be as a way of handling the kind of chaos we're living in. The witness or the watcher, though, has to look at their own pain or their own reaction as if it's external, even though it's internal. And they have to look at the external as if it belongs to them, it's internal. In other words, there's no difference really between the external and the internal. They're all just phenomena to be known, to be seen. Now, when you do that, there are aspects of reality that are missed when you're a reactive herd member. And part of that, of what you're missing, is what I call seeing, which is another aspect of reality which isn't known by the five senses. But it's a reality stream. It's a stream of information that's there available, but it requires a certain, even if you can only do it for 2 seconds, that you quiet down to notice it. If you're a really good observer, the sounds of rustling in the bushes, I'm talking about being a sambar deer again, you can tell the difference between monkey noises and tiger noises. And so I'm saying that there are levels of information or understanding that are available once you learn how to step out of the fray and become an observer. Now, I'm not saying you should go around in this state all the time. It's something you have to learn, what I call fluidity of attention. That is, learning how to turn your attention one way or another, kind of at will. Most of us, we have a biological mechanism, we all have it, that when there's, let's say, someone rings a bell behind your head and you weren't aware they were there, you immediately turn your head in that direction. It's called the orienting reflex. And this is psychology 101, and the orienting reflex is the way we learn, our organism can learn what's going on around it and also protect itself if it needs to, etc. I'm not saying you don't orient, but you have to learn to orient as a witness, not as a judge. So you orient and you go, oh, well, that's not a problem, I'll ignore it.
Right.
Or you orient it, you go, that's dangerous, I'm out of here. Or right. You orient, you go, that's dangerous, I'm going to pull out my .357 Magnum and have a shot at it.
Right.
But if you're really just a witness, you're not making that decision. You can make it afterwards if you want.
I have another one of these clarifying questions, if I may. A word that I would use for much of what you've been describing is a sense of center. And for a number of the pieces that you first started laying out, they would be, the judge and so on. It seemed to be to imply, and this is just how I talk about it to myself, how I can construct it so I can make sense of it and move it around. Is there's a sense of having a mental center. And there's a sense of having this perceptual center. And like whenever I think about the relatively small amount of sensing and seeing that I do in my particular way, I always end up indicating here. From about the top of my neck down to my perineum, this is where the impressions seem to show up for me.
Yeah, it does for many people. Yeah.
And I'm curious, not so much about this part, although we might talk about that later. I'm curious if there's a dynamic or if there's a distinction about having a center for the kind of the quality of perception that you're talking about. That if a person has this stillness and if they have this locus for their perception and there's a quality of that perception, there's as you mentioned, a stillness and so on. Is it fair to say that that could be called a sense of center for one's perception and so on?
If you have a sense of center, you're not in your center. Because a sense of center is actually, another construction that you make. And when you use your attention in the way I'm talking about, later on, you can look back at it and realize the center was your attention, your awareness, what was going on. But if you are focused on having a sense of center or trying to create one, that is actually destroying your ability to have a center, because the center requires a deployment of attention in a certain way. And that attention, you realize later on, was the center. But when you're in it, there is no center. When you're centered, there's no center. That's the only way to put it. It's still that paradoxical talk, but
so
it's true.
I'm curious, just to take it one last step, is what I think I'm hearing you say, or at least what I want it to mean, because it's the image that I got, is instead of having a center, so let's just say it's the size of a tennis ball and it's right down my hara and so on, that would be kind of a typical way to describe the experience of center and a location for it and a dimension to it and so on. And what I think I'm hearing you say is that it actually is a deployment of attention that does not itself have a center. It seems like what you're describing is something that is actually expanding beyond an orientation of center.
It is a center without you knowing it's a center, without it being a center. If you're involved with creating a center, that's not a center. That's an object you're creating.
Got it.
And you're putting your attention on that object. The opening attention to the panorama around you has no sense of now I'm in my center. It's that same thing, when you learn to meditate and you go, "Oh, I meditated." You're not anymore. As soon as you have a self-awareness of meditating, you're not meditating.
Got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
So when I say a high pain threshold, I don't mean blocking. I mean a willingness to meet pain or discomfort or what you don't want to meet. So, I mean, we all have things we don't want to meet, but we have to be willing to be there and be present to what we don't want to meet in order to meet the things we do want to meet. Because anytime you practice blocking, you might block out the thing you don't want, but you're also blocking out a lot more than that. Maybe the things you do want. That's why I talked about you have to have a high pain threshold, because you have to be willing to deal with that. So the one thing of, looking back 20 years to now, or 40 years, is the level of chaos. But I also attribute the level of chaos to growing population. We really actually have too many people on the planet. The discussion about population usually centers around, can we feed everyone? Can we house everyone? I'm not going to address those things, because probably human beings are pretty inventive. They probably figure out a way to feed more and more people and house more and more people. Maybe there's a limit, but I don't know where that limit is. I don't specialize in that kind of thing. But I will say that there's really a limit we should be looking at in terms of the chaos created by human activity. And there's always chaos around human activity. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you have so many humans that the chaos is at such a high level, you're more likely to have people who will react intensely to any kind of alteration in the environment. And I think what we've been seeing in the United States in the last number of years is partly due to the fact that too many people, too much stimulus, too much agitation, and anything triggers it. And there are a lot of injustices that trigger it. The right wing is one way of trying to address disparity. The left wing is another way of trying to address disparity. They just see it in different ways. But really, the level of agitation has nothing to do with disparity, the lack of things in people's lives. It has to do with the overabundance of intense, chaotic stimulus in people's lives.
Would it be fair to use would it be fair to use the term signal to noise ratio to talk about what you're talking about?
Yeah, the signal noise ratio is getting worse. There's more and more noise for less and less signal.
Right.
And part of it is due to overcrowding. Mm-hmm. Overcrowding on the kind of energetic, psychic dimension, as well as overcrowding on the physical dimension. They go together, and it's really, something that isn't addressed when they talk about overpopulation. And to me, that's a critical thing. And of course, one place where we see it is in Norway with lemmings. Lemmings actually, what happens with lemmings is they breed up so much that the population is so great, there's a kind of agitation which takes place, and then they start, running in different directions. They don't purposely run off a cliff, but there are a lot of cliffs in Norway. So, a whole lot of them are going to land up running off cliffs because they're trying to somehow deal with the intensity of the pressure of overpopulation. So I say psychically, if we want to save ourselves, we have to do something about the population. And, you look at it, when I was, when I was a boy, as we used to say, and in the 1940s, the population of the world was what, not a tenth, but maybe a fifth of what it is now. And, there were all kinds of places you could go where there were no people. It's getting harder and harder to find that. Yeah, you can go up into the Rockies and, climb into wilderness areas. But in your day-to-day life, it's hard to go anywhere now without the intensity of population. And as a result, I think one of the reasons, iPhones and iPads and, and, smartphones in general, whatever, are so popular, because one of the things I'm witnessing is that people are trying to distract themselves. They're trying to be outside of where they are. So they're walking down the street looking at their damn phone and, probably putting themselves and others in danger, but they're looking at their phone because their phone takes them into a world where they want to be. Maybe communicating with a friend, maybe playing a game, whatever they're doing takes them to a world where they want to be. And so they're trying hard not to be in the world where they are. And that's the other thing I would say. If you're going to be a seer, you have to be in the world where you are. Because if you're going to hear and see the subtle signals, you can't be distracted. Your attention has to be really in the moment where you are. So, and of course, this technology has, you see, I don't think it changed us. I think it facilitated a part of us that was always there. Going back to the sambar deer, we were always ready to react. But now we have this device we're looking at all the time, which is giving us a reason to react from minute to minute, from second to second. You're on your Facebook feed or you're on Instagram and something comes down the line and you go, holy crap, blah, blah, blah. And everyone is getting wired up over it. So if you want to be a seer, I'm not on social media because I just find it idiotic. But but my way of staying in touch with people is very different. I have my own way of checking in with people I care about and where they are and what's happening to them. And but I don't think I need to do it minute to minute, or even daily. I think it's and we've lost the art of learning to be alone. I mean, in a lot of the consulting work I've done, I get people, whether they're running an organization, they're having a problem, or they're just having personal problems managing their lives. I try to get them to sit for a half hour a day and do sweet fuck all. Absolutely nothing. Not try to make themselves do nothing, just sit there and whatever is going on in their head, let it go on. But inevitably, something will happen that they'll want to get up and do something else. It's just an impulse. Oh, I forgot I might have left a stove on a pot on the stove, or I might have done this, or gee, I better check my calendar about the thing tomorrow. But to actually sit there for half an hour and let all those things come up and just watch them and do nothing else. It's actually, people find that a very, very hard exercise to accomplish. They don't, when they're sitting there doing it, say, oh, this is pretty easy. And then the next minute they're up doing something. I mean, for a half an hour and then later on expand it to an hour, you do nothing except sit there and just pay attention. If there's traffic noise outside, you can pay attention to that. If there's a roaring in your head about something, you can pay attention to that. But to not act, to not react. Because one of the things about pain or stimulus is it makes you react. I was talking about the orienting reflex. That's one version of it. But to actually not react and give yourself that empty space to sit in where you're in your center without actually knowing you're in the center. You're just the observer there. And that's pretty much what I'm talking about. So that's another aspect of what's changed in the world. We're overpopulated now. And we're overstimulated. And we're getting more and more frenetic. And we're looking more and more like lemmings. And, lemmings don't intentionally kill themselves. They just start running around getting in ever more frenetic circles. And part of that, you're going to land up crashing into things or running off cliffs. So that's another aspect of it. I think I remember growing up, one of the big things was the threat of nuclear war. I mean, a lot of people now don't remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we came within a millimeter of launching a nuclear war. And Putin's getting up there these days and threatening to use nuclear devices. Now, either Putin's a moron, which I doubt he is, or he's bluffing, because he knows that pointed at him are at least 3 other major nuclear powers with as many nuclear weapons, a total of many more nuclear weapons. And then Putin has been bragging that he has these hypersonic, rockets, and he can shoot anything down. Now, if you're a statistician, I spent a lot of my years writing statistical analysis of data. If you understand that even if he has a fantastic system for stopping other people's missiles, and 5,000 missiles come at him, even if 1% get through with multiple nuclear warheads, his country is over. And I think he knows that. Or if he doesn't know it, his advisors would be telling him that. So, and the same thing goes for us. You think you have something that'll stop missiles. One missile with 5 warheads on it, each a megaton hydrogen bomb. Think of what that is. A 1 megaton hydrogen bomb is, let's see, what is 500 times is more powerful than what hit Hiroshima. Hiroshima was 20 kilotons. So 20 into 50 kilotons is, no, it's 2,500 times more powerful. So if you think of it in those terms, we're kind of back to that again. But now we have the level of chaos is so much higher. I think it's more likely that could be triggered. Because whether Putin, who I believe is a classic psychopath, is emotionally reactive to the world, which he seems to have very little emotional reaction to anything except a bit of anger and annoyance that he's not the new Vlad the Great. He's been talking about Peter the Great. I call him Vlad the Small. And but we're in this kind of chaotic storm. And that's a worry, because everyone is more reactive in this psychic, emotional, physical storm that we live in now.
I'm curious if you would pull on that thread just a little further at the less global scale, the less political and militaristic level, down to the level, still violence, but just violence at the level of the U.S. citizenry, for instance. There are ways that I scan and I see a tremendous impetus for unbridled violence really soon.
Agreed. I agree with you. Now, it's interesting that for many years, the crime rates were going down in places like New York City, maybe not Chicago, I'm not sure about, but in many places, they're going up now. And I think the combination of social media and COVID have been part of the catalyst for that increase, because the level of agitation people are feeling, And, when I talk about sitting still and not getting up, well, one of the ways we deal with our agitation is we get up and move around and do things. So with COVID, effectively, a lot of people weren't able to get up and move around and do things, but they're still living in this increasing chaos. So what you get is when they do get up and move around, they move around and cause a lot more damage. So yeah, that all looks different. And so I think those are the big things I notice. And but if you want to stop contributing to it, you have to learn how to sit still. If you want to make your little personal contribution to not creating chaos, yeah, you can get angry, you can get upset, you can get fearful, but just sit there with it. That's what I mean, high pain threshold.
Right.
Because you won't want to sit there with it. You want to make it go away. So for anger, people think if they act out on their anger, it'll fix it. Mm-hmm. With fear, they think if they run away, it'll fix it. With anxiety, they think if they take a drug, it'll fix it. The only thing that'll really fix it is if you learn how to sit still with it, and actually just watch it.
Yeah. I'm curious if this element is a part of this dynamic that you're talking about, this element being what appears to be the complete across the board corrosion of or destruction of our relationship with just reality, a shared reality. That seems to be at risk everywhere. But then perhaps more pointedly, how we interact with science, with as close to a kind of a default or a given foundation for what we could call a shared truth. And that seems to have just been slaughtered across the board.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how that dynamic fits in what you're talking about.
Well, that's part of the paranoid reaction, where you come up with a story. And if your story doesn't intersect well with someone else's story, let's say someone's story is, the worldwide conspiracy, and that, a small group is running the world and manipulating us, and we're having chips implanted in us. And then the story being told by someone, let's say, who does science and looks at a hematologist who maybe looks at our blood and can't find any chips in it. Well, it's the story of I don't find chips in your blood is something we have procedures to try to do to see if there are chips in our blood. But the story where there are chips in our blood aren't being managed the same way. They're a story that's attempting to make sense of the feeling that something is taking over our lives. And I think in one type of story, we stay empirically connected. We want to look at the world, we want to look at blood samples, etc. In the other story, we're really trying to identify the threat and identify the threat that accounts for a whole lot of beliefs we have and stories we're telling ourselves. But it all comes down to the kind of story we create, and are the stories we create testable? Now, to criticize science, to put it in technical terms, science believes it's doing something ontological. It's really finding what it truly is, where it's really epistemic. It means it's actually creating a body of consistent knowledge. Now, I rather trust that consistent knowledge than a story that's just created without any kind of testing. But, that's kind of where I landed up. And I can understand people land up with other stories. But I think if you're going to be a seer, as I said, you have to go where the pain is. And part of the pain is you have to really look at your own story and kind of bring some critical acumen to it. Now, here's where I become a philosophical skeptic. And by skeptic, I don't mean the ordinary standard understanding of the word skeptic. Most people who call themselves skeptics are actually true believers. They're just believers in what you're saying is not true. And so that's not skepticism. Skepticism was a philosophical school originally founded in ancient Greece by Pyrrho, and it was called Pyrrhonism. And then it was picked up later on in Rome, in ancient Rome, and the foremost, writer and sort of propagator of that belief was a guy named Sextus Empiricus. And from the point of view of skepticism, if you say you know what the final truth is, you're no longer a skeptic. That's the skeptical position. So your skepticism is about the belief that any final truth is the end of the line. So in that sense, I'm a skeptic. I'm open to the new and whatever is happening, but at the same time, I'm not going to settle on the final explanation of what's going on here, because to put it in from the point of view of my science background, the data is not all in yet, and the data will never all be in, because that requires an infinite amount of time, and so we'll never see all the data. So we try to make good guesses. And I think the guesses science makes have a bit more solidity to them. They're a bit more trustworthy, because you can go back and test them over and over again. If someone says, well, when I had my vaccination, that I was injected full of microchips put in there by the Gates Foundation, well, we can do a microscopic examination of many of the tissues in my body. And if we find a chip, then I'll go, hey, you're onto something. But if we don't find any chips and we keep looking and we never find chips, but we rather maintain our story, the story is there's a chip there somewhere, you just haven't found it yet. Well, I'll tend on the story of, well, we've tested this, we've tested that, and it doesn't look like there are chips there. But, the story isn't closed, but might be. But I'm going to operate as if there aren't. And so as a seer, you have to operate in the world that way. Because if you decide what's true, there are people who call themselves seers or psychics, and they know exactly what's going on and what the truth is. I'm saying I'm a skeptical seer. So, I can't make a final statement about what's going on. I can tell you what I perceive, and, that will either fit in your world or not. And I can tell you to some degree how I perceive it, but I can only offer that. I can't actually prove anything. And that's one of the things that science had to come to grips with in the early 20th century, that they couldn't prove anything. They could only prove the negative. They could only say, well, it's not false. So, but I don't know what the truth is, but it's not false. So that's pretty much my story.
Yeah.
Do you have something, another question, or have I run off into too philosophical a direction?
No, I appreciate it. I actually have been, thanks to some wondrous translation, I'm not much of a philosophical thinker, and there are constructs, there are ways that people who are adept in that arena, they speak with one another, they have shared assumptions and shared knowledge and so on. I have almost none of that. And so I've struggled. with really in any sort of in-depth exploration of philosophy. So I always appreciate it when it's translated and it's brought to a level that I can relate in some way. So I appreciate what you were just talking about.
When you're listening to some couple of people having some philosophical discourse and you're there and you're involved in it, ask them what Wittgenstein said about philosophy in the end, considered to be one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century.
He's one of the favorites of this guy who translates for me, so I'll be sure to ask him.
Yeah, because Wittgenstein said basically it's all just a language game. So he's saying, in effect, philosophy isn't really doing anything. It's not solving any problems. Yeah. It's just engaged with, linguistic arguments and sorting through that.
Yeah.
And I've come to a similar conclusion recently, even though philosophy's always been something that I've been engaging in. But I think that I'm kind of siding with Wittgenstein now, although earlier times I didn't.
All right. Well, I know that our time is kind of getting close to being done for today, but I do have what may be an odd question. I'm curious if you have, from any point in your time being a seer, are there any pieces of art or music or plays or any muse that you can point at, or experiences in nature, any elements that you've experienced on a regular basis in your life that have just by experiencing them, they've opened up another portion of your seeing, another portion of your presence, another portion of that still point in yourself in a way that you noticed?
All of the above.
Would you mind just sharing some that have been particularly enchanting for you?
A particular piece of music, for example?
Sure, yeah.
Stravinsky's Petrushka, but also, Hank Williams singing "I'm So Lonely."
Yes, yes.
It's really, it's just vast. Or looking at, basically Starry Night at the MoMA in New York, just standing in front of it, and the total impact of it. They all open, if you are willing to let these encounters open more. They all open more. They all open another level of experiencing, seeing, knowing. Art and music, dance, even theater. I didn't like theater till I saw Marat Sade. And the problem I always had with theater is because I read people very directly as a seer, the actors and their parts always were different. And so sitting in the audience and watching someone play a part, and at the same time, I can perceive that person as something entirely different than their part. It just seemed too cacophonous for me. It was just too, kind of, I guess, just too crazy. But Marat Sade, which was about, Marat and his bath in a mental institution, and the players had to get into pretty near psychotic states to actually play that. And I remember going to see it in New York many years ago, and I went, wow, they really are crazy. And it was really happening.
Yeah.
And I realized it could be done. It's just that maybe I was, until then, seeing bad theater.
Well, given what you've just said, and I know we've got a very little time left, I'm curious if you could say a bit more of what were you experiencing? Can you articulate some of that, what you're calling an opening? A word that came to mind when you just were talking about Marat Sade and how it the people, the players, had a consistency with between their character and themselves. And a word that I often use for that kind of experience of myself is a coherence. And that sense of coherence is a huge part of my own body of work and my own practices, because there seems to be almost a synergy that occurs above a certain level of coherence in different aspects of my perception, that when they stack up, when they line up, something more than the sum of the parts that I could point to occurs. And I'm just curious if anything like that is going on, or how might you articulate what you're calling a special kind of inspiration that's coming from these elements?
Well, when I listen to music, for instance, it opens me emotionally to maybe parts of myself that are out of range at the moment. And once that opens, I can then replay the whole day and recognize how, it was influenced by the state I was in. And I can replay every individual I met during the course of the day and recognize the impact I had on them and see how they're still carrying it. And it allows me to renew my perception of people I'm very close to. It's very easy to lose sight of people you're very close to. And so music is a door opener for emotional awareness and psychic connection to others. And I use it that way all the time, whether it's, Igor's, Petrushka, or whether it's, Hank Williams, I'm so lonely I could cry. It's just, it just is there and can open me and bring me to that, let's call it that center place that you don't, when you're not in the center.
Right.
And I can see people, events differently. So it's some people can do this with meditation, but music is my number one choice.
Yes.
For
yes.
that. And that's why I have the computer full of music, because depending on where I want to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I now have about 15,000 tracks on the computer.
Right.
So I have something to choose from.
Yes, you
and
do.
I tend not to like the streaming services because I can't really just pick on nuance of something that I'm looking for. Sometimes they just, feed it to me kind of by chance, but I like to be able to go find something that, then works for that moment.
Yeah.
I think we'll have to part company now until next time. And I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you. And I hope there will be a next time.
Thank you. Me too, Peter. It's just always such a delight, and I learn and experience so much. And thank you so much for your time and willingness. And if I have anything to do with it, there will be another time, a next time, and I'll reach out to you to schedule that very soon. Thank you.
Okay, Dean. Cheers.
Thank you, brother.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.